Good morning again. Buenos dias. Welcome to today's conversation on pandemic response and executive authority, the case of El Salvador. This is the latest in the Inter-American Dialogue's ongoing series of events analyzing the impact of COVID-19 in the Americas. My name is Michael Camilleri. I direct the Dialogue's Peter D. Bell Rule of Law program, and we are delighted that so many of you could join us for this conversation with our three outstanding guests. A special saludo to everyone in El Salvador who woke up early to accompany this conversation. We turn our attention today to issues of democratic governance, and specifically to the case of El Salvador. Like many other countries in Latin America, over a month ago, El Salvador introduced strict travel restrictions and stay-at-home orders to try to mitigate the spread of the coronavirus. But the measures adopted by President Nayib Bukele have come under increasing scrutiny. His security forces have arbitrarily detained hundreds of people in police stations and so-called containment centers for allegedly violating the quarantine. President Bukele has defied rulings by the Constitutional Chamber of the Supreme Court that found these detentions illegal. And this week, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, expressed serious concern over the rule of law and constitutional order in El Salvador as a result of these developments. Now, this all takes place, of course, in the context of a regional and global conversation about the kinds of measures that are permissible and appropriate in responding to the very real threat of COVID-19. We are witnessing important debates and, in some cases, real cause for concern about both public health and about civil liberties, separation of powers, and respect for democratic governance. And some fear that El Salvador's aggressive and arguably disproportionate measures could be the harbinger of things to come elsewhere in Latin America. So on that note, I'm very pleased to welcome and introduce our three experts. Carlos Dada is founder of the digital news outlet El Faro. He is a past recipient of the Maria Morse Cabot Prize for Latin America Reporting. Leonor Arteaga is a senior program officer at the Due Process of Law Foundation, DPLF, and she's also a member of the El Salvador National Commission for the Search of Disappeared Persons, CONABúsqueda. And Jose Miguel Vivanco is the America's Director of Human Rights Watch. Before turning to our speakers, let me remind you that you can follow this event on Twitter at El Salvador, hashtag El Salvador DDHH, and at The Dialogue. We invite participants to submit questions using the event hashtag on Twitter, or to email questions to meetings@thedialogue.org. Again, that hashtag is El Salvador DDHH for Derechos Humanos. I will now ask our speakers to share some initial thoughts on the situation in El Salvador from the perspective of their respective vantage points. I'll then moderate a conversation, and we will turn to questions from you all at the end of the conversation. So with that, Carlos Dada, perhaps I could turn it to you first. You're in El Salvador. You can give us the perspective from there on the ground. Carlos, over to you.
Gracias, Michael. Good morning to everybody. Thanks for attending this conversation. Well, I think you gave a very concise overview of the situation here, Michael. In this dilemma that all world leaders are confronting now between health measures and economy measures, it's clear that the Salvadoran government decided very soon to bet on the health measures. He did it very early, almost before anybody else in the Americas. Since the first days of March, he closed the airport, closed the borders, and put everybody coming into quarantine. And I think he's been widely recognized as audacious for taking these measures before anyone else in this continent was taking the pandemic seriously. And I think that most of the initial decisions that he made are now part of the book that everybody knows should be put into measures that should be put into action to stop the contagion of the virus. The problem is when you take these decisions and put them on the ground. And what happened here in El Salvador since the first moment is that these measures were not enforced or backed by a medical plan or a scientific plan, or even a plan at all. They were enforced by the two security forces that the country has, which is the army and the police. So most of the approach to controlling the pandemic has been enforced by the army and the police, not by the health system. If you look at the numbers, the initial audacious measures and timely measures actually won a lot of time for this government. I mean, up to now, I think we have relatively low numbers of the virus. I mean, when I'm talking to you guys that are in Washington, you would laugh at our numbers. It's around 225 positive cases. And we have 7 people died so far because of coronavirus. The problem lies somewhere else. The problem lies, I would say, in the near future, because since these measures were not put in the ground based on health measures, what happened is that the president decided that he would make all the decisions, no matter if they are lawful or not. And I'm sure my colleagues will talk more about that. But that means arresting, detaining thousands of people and taking them to what are called contention centers, where there's no health measures at all. So if you had one person there sick with the virus, then you have 4,000 people sick, that, or at least with an epidemiological contact with the sick person. So what I'm trying to tell you is that the decisions that were made at the initial days were not followed by a serious plan to really contain the virus. So in the end, the real result is that you have a mess on the contention centers, a mess in the hospitals. You have almost the same number of positive cases than the number of health workers, and I mean doctors and nurses, that are now under quarantine because of the mess they have in the hospitals. And you have a president that has been obsessed with accumulating power out of this crisis. I know you wanted a brief overview, so let me just quickly say something else. The other problem is that we don't have an economic plan, right? We have a government that likes to make decisions isolated, who has neglected all help and advice from every single sector of society, being scientists, businessmen, universities, etc. So we don't have an economic plan. And as opposed to a country like the United States, for example, in El Salvador, you have 75% of the population that is either unemployed or has an informal job. What is an informal job? A job for people that need to go outside every day to earn their living. Up to this date, we don't know what's going to happen to these people. There's people already starving right now. And of course, this is a poor country. We don't have enough. The state has no money support to provide to them. And we can talk later if you want about, I mean, this is an overview of the situation on the ground. And you have the army on the streets, which have been empowered by the president to make decisions on the people they stop on the street. And it's up to them if they send them to quarantine centers or not. And I'm sure Leonora and Jose Miguel will talk more about this, because the Supreme Court already ruled this is unconstitutional. And the president already said, I don't care about what the Supreme Court says. This is an emergency, and in an emergency, the government has to do what I say. This is basically.
Great. Terrific. That's great, Carlos. Thanks for the broad and I think very balanced kind of panorama, and it's a great transition to Leonor. Obviously, there's a lot of issues that Carlos put on the table that we'll come back to, but maybe to zero in on one, this issue of mass detentions, containment centers, the Supreme Court rulings. You're a Salvadoran lawyer. Can you kind of succinctly walk us through that particular kind of legal dispute and how President Bukele is responding to the pushback from the courts?
Hello, Michael. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks everybody that is here with us this morning. Well, it seems that President Bukele is using this pandemic situation to gain control over the two other state powers, and is pushing for a constitutional crisis, right? As Carlos mentioned, in the last weeks, there's been hundreds of detentions by the police trying to enforce the quarantine rules. And many human rights organizations and just people that have been victims of these detentions filed several petitions before the Constitutional Chamber of the Supreme Court. And this time, the Supreme Court very quickly gave a real good answer to the population, right? So in the last maybe 15 days, the Supreme Court ruled at least 3 times, right? Saying that these detentions, police detentions, are unconstitutional. And the court insisted that a law must be passed before police have any authority to arrest and detain somebody for violating the quarantine order, right? Because such kind of detention could not be constitutionally authorized just by an executive decree. And every time, I mean, every time that the Constitutional Court ruled, Bukele publicly dismissed this Supreme Court orders to refrain from arresting people in violation of his quarantine. And the court is just attempting to stop police abuses, right, that are being promoted by Bukele himself and his administration. So Bukele has yet to comply with these rulings. Really, this lack of compliance is a clear threat to the constitutional separation of powers, right? As we all know, the separation and independence of public powers is a fundamental component of the rule of law and is an essential element of democracy, right? Recently, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and also Michelle Bachelet, as you mentioned in the introduction, have strongly reminded Bukele to respect rule of law, right? Some experts are even considering that we should be debating whether his pattern of disregard for the court constitutes grounds or not to invoke the democratic charter among the OAS. I mean, Bukele continues to act as if the pandemic justifies just suppressing any critical voice, right? Including the critical role as a check of the Supreme Court. He even once claimed on a tweet, as he usually does, referring to the Supreme Court justices, constitutional justices, 5 people are not going to decide the death of hundreds of thousands of Salvadorians, no matter how much ink or stamps they use, right? Referring to the rules. I mean, in general, President Bukele's frequent statements by Twitter or by speeches that are broadcast to the nation not only encourage police excessive use of force when enforcing lockdown rules, but he also encouraged basically a hate speech against everyone who criticized him, right? So this is really a critical moment in El Salvador. The international community, I mean, cannot afford to turn just a blind eye when such a popular leader openly ignores and provokes that others ignore constitutional rulings on issues regarding fundamental rights, right? So also human rights organizations that are using strategic litigation before the Supreme Court and media reporting on these issues are also a target of this kind of attacks. So it's time for everybody to support these efforts that are taking place on the ground, and to send a really strong message that these disregards of constitutional court rules cannot continue happening.
Great. Terrific. Thank you, Leonor. That's excellent. And also a great transition to Jose Miguel Vivanco of Human Rights Watch, who has been one of those sending strong messages of concern regarding many of the developments you mentioned. So Jose Miguel, let's turn to you for your analysis. I think you may need to unmute yourself so we can hear you.
All right. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much, Michael, for inviting me. And I think this panel is very timely to discuss the case of El Salvador. But let me put this in context in the region, just in few minutes, and to see how the democracies in Latin America has been reacting to the pandemic. There are several governments in the region. I'm thinking especially about Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Peru, to a certain extent, that are implementing pretty strict measures and to deal with this challenge, and but in full respect for fundamental freedoms and rights. Obviously, the pandemic, like any other emergency, it requires some restrictions of the exercise of certain rights, like, for instance, right to organize a meeting, restrictions of mobilization, and those sort of things. But it's important to understand that whatever is the nature of the emergency, and particularly if we are dealing with a health problem, serious health problem, it's important to develop policies and practice that are consistent with basic rights. That are, in other words, that a government is not implementing draconian legislation or draconian decrees or norms that are going to result in excessive use of force or massive arbitrary arrest. There are interesting cases in the region where some leaders, thinking especially on Bolsonaro in Brazil, and until very recently, AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico, who, during the whole period and even until now, in the case of Bolsonaro in Brazil, are trying to downplay or minimizing the problem, and they are not actually interested in, particularly this characterization applies today to Bolsonaro. They are not interested in addressing the issue. The problem of the pandemic, the challenge that the coronavirus presented to the world, is a serious one. This is not a fiction. This is a lethal problem that needs to be contained, and governments have the obligation to protect the health of the population and to avoid the spread of this virus, and provide with health attention to those ones who are already suffering the virus. Now, the case of Bukele in El Salvador is particularly troubling because from day number one, and I agree with the description of my colleagues, particularly Carlos, Carlos Dada, Bukele took this very seriously and took very strong measures. The trouble with Bukele's approach is that his draconian instructions via tweet ignore the implementation in the real life, of this request, to the point that his policies have resulted in hundreds of Salvadorians who are in arbitrary detention just because they violate the quarantine. And the conflict with the Supreme Court is because the Supreme Court is asking the government and is not only to respect its rulings, but also to modify the policy to the extent that those ones who violate the quarantine, those ones who are outside their home, essentially, without a justification, that is not only per se a reason for them to go to some sort of prison detention for 30 days in locations where there are no health support, where they could, actually be these locations contagious. And in other words, what the court is asking the president, that the approach to the pandemic should be preventive, should not be punitive. This is not, that is not the way to deal with this issue. And the president insists on his sort of military approach to the problem with, in practical terms, with, as a result, several abuses committed by security forces. That, I think, is the central issue here that concerns us, and particularly the lack of respect and the lack of attention of the president, and essentially the flagrant challenge by the president to the several rulings of the Supreme Court, to the point that I believe that the rule of law, the basic principles of separation of power are in danger in El Salvador. And it's time for the Organization for American States, and particularly Secretary General Luis Almagro, to step in and to at least call for a meeting of the Permanent Council of the Organization for American States to discuss to which extent the lack of respect, the lack of enforcement of the rulings of the Supreme Court, the top tribunals in the country, represent or not a challenge for the democratic charter.
Okay, thank you, Jose Miguel. Both you and Leonor have mentioned the potential role of the OAS and the democratic charter, so that's something I think we'll want to come back to. Carlos, maybe let me turn back to you, and I just want to broaden the aperture a little bit in terms of President Bukele. Your colleague from El Faro, Oscar Martinez, wrote an excellent piece in the New York Times this week in which he kind of laid out a broader pattern or a longer pattern of behavior by President Bukele. Maybe most prominently, this past February, he led a group of soldiers into the Congress to demand that the Congress approve some security funding that he had requested. And so there seems to be, not just an isolated case of taking extreme measures to respond to the pandemic, but perhaps a broader kind of tendency with President Bukele. At the same time, it's quite clear his levels of popularity are very high. One poll put him above 90% recently. And other polls have him in the 80s. Whatever the precise number is, it's very clear that many Salvadorans support him. So maybe you can help us kind of understand who President Bukele is, and also for Salvadorans watching some of the issues that we've been discussing here, are they not concerned about the autocratic streak, or are they attracted to Bukele in spite of these tendencies?
Yeah, there. Gracias, Michael. Bukele is a populist by the book, right? But he also happens to be very popular. I mean, the only way to explain how this guy came to be what he is now is if you look at what was before, we had a political system based on two political parties who played at the extremes of the political system. Arena, who was born as a paramilitary ultra-right group in the 80s, and the FMLN, who was a former guerrilla Marxist armed movement in the 80s too. So when the war was over, these two parties became the basis of the political system. And I ask you to pay attention about these words, the parties. Parties are institutions, right? So both parties had the opportunity to govern El Salvador, and both did a very lousy job. They were very corrupt. And the conditions of the majority of the population were not better from their exercise of government. So here comes this guy who is a new generation, who is cool, and he basically destroyed the old political system and substituted it with himself, not an institution, but a person. So as we know how populist discourse are, he represents the people. He is the people. The people talks through him. And he is very popular because he has made an enemy of everyone who doesn't agree with him, beginning with the political parties that he sent to a minority position. So since they have been proven to be corrupt, then he is the savior of the new country. Of course, there's a paradox here, very similar of the discourse that you hear in the United States, that the leader that talks on behalf of the workers, of the people, is a spoiled son of a millionaire who has never suffered any of the needs that most of the population suffers. That is the case with Bukele. But so far, in a very few time, he has already declared enemies independent journalists, human rights defenders, the opposition, of course, all critics, the Congress, the Supreme Court, the Attorney General, and everyone who opposes his word, which is not even his decrees or his laws, his word. This is a guy that governs by tweet. He has said publicly that all these sectors that I have just told you, from journalists to human rights associations to the Supreme Court, these are people that want the death of Salvadorans. This inflammatory discourse, this hate speech or hate rhetoric that is backed by an army of trolls that he commands, has this country very divided in a time of crisis like this. What the book of crisis tell you that this is the part that he's not implementing is that you need a leader that unifies. You need to lead the whole country into one single direction and everybody to understand where we are going. Well, none of this is happening. You have to believe almost by a leap of faith into a guy that is ruling by Twitter. I'm going to give you a brief example, Michael. A few days ago, there was a video from a TV station in a beach city called La Libertad. La Libertad is a fisherman's port surrounded by small villages with very poor people. They all came down to the city the day that they were going to receive their paychecks, right? Perhaps their last paycheck in this crisis. So Bukele saw this video and he suddenly decided that these people were disobeying his orders of lockdown. So he tweeted an order to the Minister of Defense asking him to impose a military siege on this city. A military siege, right? So this is a guy that is not willing to obey the Constitution or any law that gets into his way, but has the ability to order the Minister of Defense to impose an unlawful siege over a city just because he saw a video he didn't like. That's the kind of populism that we are that we are now facing. And this is a discourse, of course, this hate discourse, this populist discourse as opposed to what we saw last century, this discourse has no depth. There's no ideological division. There's not a class axis. It is just around a single figure. I mean, this guy came from the FMLN and he has a rightist government. So this is not even ideological. He is just making everybody against him a minority, right? And minorities are not welcome in this government. Minorities are the enemy. Minorities are these guys that want the death of thousands of Salvadorans, right? And I am really worried about this hate speech, because in a country like this, with very fragile rule of law, with so many weapons, and with such uncontrolled violence as we have seen in the last years, an inflammatory discourse can have serious consequences. And I don't think Bukele is responsible. I mean, no, let me rephrase that. I didn't say, I'm sorry, my English is getting rusty. I don't think Bukele is being responsible for the consequences of his hate speech and his act, which is only a populist speech to grab more power. Does it make sense now?
Absolutely. Thank you, Carlos. And you've written powerfully about some incidents of stigmatization, including of health workers in El Salvador in this context. So I think you're well placed and right to mention that issue. Leonor, let me turn to you and ask you just to project a little bit into the future in two ways. Narrowly, in terms of these court cases, kind of what happens next? How does this kind of constitutional showdown come to a head, and how do you see it potentially being resolved? And then, more broadly, with some of the issues that Carlos Dada referred to regarding civic space, regarding the president's attacks on civil society, on the media, the human rights ombudsman, anyone essentially who's critical of his decisions. What does this portend for democracy in El Salvador writ large, in your view?
Thank you, Michael. This is not the first time that there's been a tension between powers, right, in El Salvador, because several years ago, the FMLN tried also to disempower the Constitutional Court and the Constitutional Chamber of the Supreme Court, and maybe for different purposes, but I think that it's important that international community gives a lot of political support to the Supreme Court, so they can sustain and they feel empowered to continue, right, ruling the same kind of decisions, and also trying to enforce them in different ways. And also it's important that civil society groups that are using the judicial system continues to believe that the Constitutional Court is it's still a very needed tool for check and balances, right? And the role of Supreme Court is now more important than ever. On the other hand, we all have talked how Bukele himself and his administration has become really an army against everybody who opposed their decisions, even the words, as Carlos said. In this scenario, public space for human rights defender and civil society groups is getting really small, right? And civil society groups that are openly opposing, or not just opposing, but just pointing out what are the human rights standards and how the government should follow them based on the Constitution and all human rights international obligations. It's being attacked, right, in different ways, and this has become a pattern. I mean, those are not isolated cases. This has become a pattern. Like every day, the president is through Twitter or through troll actions trying to basically show who is the enemy and encouraging everybody else to target those people. So it's also important to support different civil society groups, and I think that as in the past, El Salvador needs a very strong citizenship, organized and not organized, because this is the time where a government is trying basically to show that they are the answer to everybody and that they represent what people want. And this is a very dangerous speech because it's very clear that President Bukele is basically trying to control everything for political purposes, and his public interest is not real, right? It's not real. So this is a time for citizenship to be really strong. And in another, just to finish, all the messages that comes from Bukele are also like fear messages, that people feel fear that they paralyzed, right? That's one of the very dangerous consequences. El Salvador comes from a history of serious human rights violations, a lot of fear, a lot of pain, and it's not right. It's not just to begin another phase in the country where people cannot openly speak and say what they think, right? It's important that the government gives enough space so everybody can feel free to say how they feel, and this is not happening. People are afraid in so many ways in El Salvador right now.
Thank you, Leonor. Jose Miguel, there's I think you mentioned in your first intervention, there's a group of countries in Latin America that have been sort of cavalier in their approach to COVID-19. Brazil, most prominently. We could, I think, mention Nicaragua in that sense as well. And then you mentioned a number of countries that have been aggressive in responding to the virus, but within a framework of rule of law. You mentioned Chile, Argentina, a few others. There is I think, a concern more broadly in the world, and Hungary is maybe the most prominent case of countries taking excessive, disproportionate, even authoritarian measures under the cover of COVID-19. And I think, what we're hearing today is that El Salvador potentially falls into that category. My question for you, thinking about Latin America in particular, do you see El Salvador as an outlier in that sense, or do you see it as a potential harbinger, as a case that we should be watching, not only out of concern for what's happening inside the country, but also as a potential predictor of some measures that we may see elsewhere and need to be alive and responsive to? I think you'll need to unmute, Jose Miguel.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Look, in my initial remarks, I refer just to democracies, and Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, Chile, and so on and so forth. And I do believe that El Salvador is a democracy. I didn't make much reference to dictatorships like Cuba, Nicaragua, or Venezuela that deserve a different approach, and they are they have serious problems in dealing with this issue, and where there is not even a facade of democracy. The case of El Salvador is very troubling because the president has shown to govern, or to the style of the president to run that country. It shows that he has a very, very strong autocratic tendencies. In my view, he behaved like a bully. He's in direct contempt of the rule of law, and particularly the Supreme Court decision. But what I think is important in El Salvador is to understand that it is a democracy, and it's really, really impressive how civil society is reacting, and how the media is defending its role in an open society, and how the judiciary, and particularly the justice of the Supreme Court, are showing tremendous commitment to the rule of law. They are not acting like bureaucrats. They are concerns for the health of democracy, and all of these democratic institutions are precarious, but deserve attention and support. Your question is, to which extent this type of military approach in El Salvador that we have witnessed in different regions of the world might become a model that other leaders will replicate. And it is indeed a serious question, and we do have the risk that if the international community, that's why it's so important for the international community to react on time, and to not to apply double standards. Latin America is not only Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. The Trump administration seems to have that type of approach. They are very eloquent, and they are very ready, and for the right reasons, to react when in those three countries you have abuse of power and outrageous human rights violations. But here, objectively, we are facing a government that is acting with reckless disregard to fundamental democratic principles. And so far from the US, there is actually a very strong statement from Chairman Engel from the House. McGovern, Congressman McGovern also issued a statement, and Senator Patrick Leahy condemning what is going on in El Salvador. But no a single word from the State Department, from the ambassador, the US ambassador in El Salvador. The European Union has been pretty much absent in this during this period. It is very dangerous to let this develops happening in El Salvador without any public statement and reaction from the international community. And so far, and my last reference is to Luis Almagro, the Secretary General, who is usually very eloquent and very active on Twitter, at least. So, but the fact that the OAS is not paying attention to this very serious constitutional crisis in the context of the pandemic, I think is setting the wrong precedent.
Thank you, Jose Miguel. Let me stay with you on that point, because we actually received a question on Twitter regarding the OAS specifically. I know Human Rights Watch put out a statement calling on the OAS to invoke the Democratic Charter. Can you just lay out specifically what kind of measures you'd like to see the OAS adopt in response to the developments that you described?
The Democratic Charter was established in 2001 and has been applied in multiple crises in the region. And it's an extremely useful instrument to preserve the fundamentals of a democratic system. And one of those, and there is a section in the Democratic Charter, is the need to preserve separation of power and to respect decisions adopted by the Supreme Court. The fact that the president of El Salvador is openly challenging the authority of the Supreme Court by even describing them like, just five guys, 5 guys are not going to make decisions that are going to have impact for the rest of the population. It's equivalent to the US president referring to 9 guys in the US are not going to decide this matter. 9 guys are, the members of the Supreme Court, and you need to be, we understand in a constitutional democracy that you are bound by that decision. So the Democratic Charter has a specific language that is, and the charter should be triggered every time that there is some sort of a serious threat to democratic principles. The basic step that the OAS should take is at least a meeting convoked by any state member, anyone, or the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, a meeting to discuss the case of El Salvador, just to start the examination. And that is, the first step is a very, minimal one. And but so far, nobody is on the record, not a single government in the entire region, or the Secretary General with regard to this case.
Great, thank you, Jose Miguel. I'm going to continue with some of the questions we're receiving online. Maybe I'll go to Carlos Dada next. There's a question about the role of the opposition, the FMLN and the Arena, as well as civil society in, on the one hand, promoting dialogue with President Bukele, and on the other hand, providing oversight to the executive branch. Could you comment on the role that those actors are playing?
I have to say that what happened? Hello?
You're still on.
Okay. Here, yeah, I just missed the screen. I'm sorry. I just have to say that what we're talking about, I mean, the style of government by President Bukele is due that he has no opposition. I mean, both Arena and the FMLN are parties that are on their grounds, on ashes, and they have not been able to rebuild themselves. I mean, right now, the president of Arena is a person that no one knows. He is nowhere to be seen, and he is not leading any opposition efforts. He is just a Mr. Nobody that nobody even knows what his name is. In the case of the FMLN, his general coordinator is the former vice president, a man that has been accused of corruption. So he has no credibility at all. Neither the FMLN nor Arena, they were so comfortable in their power positions before Bukele came into the scene that they haven't found the way to react, or they haven't even reflected on their new position in this new country. So they have no capability at all of leading an opposition to this government, Michael. I mean, what happened on February 9th, and I think we must not forget this. On February 9th, President Bukele had demanded from the Congress to approve a loan for military purposes. The Congress didn't summon to vote for it, so he, claiming a constitutional power, he ordered to summon the Congress, and then he went there with the army. Not even during our years of dictatorship, and let me make a parenthesis here, El Salvador had the longest running dictatorship in Latin America, from the 30s till the 80s, right? With a very few interruptions. Not even during those years, not even military presidents dared to take the army inside Congress. This is what happens. And by the way, Jose Miguel and Leonor, there was nothing to come from Mr. Almagro or the OAS, as you very well know, right? So what happened on February 9th, Michael, marks like a parting moment, because in that moment, Bukele violated two of the basic pillars of our democratic system. And let me remind you that our democratic system was born out of our peace agreements that put an end to our civil war in 1992. Which are those pillars that Mr. Bukele broke that day on February 9th? First, the sacred pillar that the army should never again be put into our political life, that the army should stay away from our political life. Bukele brought them back in. Right? The second pillar that he broke that day is that the peace agreements consisted on an agreement between two warring parties. So the condition for democracy to be born was that both parties committed that any difference, and they had many, should be decided in the institutions of the country. Mr. Bukele also broke that sacred pillar on February 9th. He entered the Congress, and this sounds like a cartoon, but it's real, right? He took the chair of the president of the Congress, and Mr. Bukele turned his eyes up, prayed to God, and then left Congress and said that God had stopped him, right, from taking control of Congress, that God asked him to be patient and give the Congress one more week to approve his military demands. This is the kind of president we have. If we were not aware before, February 9th was the undisputable proof that this is not a president that cares for democracy or the rule of law. That's why he has been so obsessed to have the army by his side. And this is why he's so dangerous. Michael, I don't know if this makes any sense. And just let me end with something else. This is a great moment for populists and autocrats, because it may sound preposterous, but this is the way it is. The whole world is living through a global crisis that for some weird reason is being addressed locally. So every single country is only worried about what happens in their borders. But this is so grave that very few countries have an eye for somebody else. This is a great time for autocrats, right? And since, as Jose Miguel and Leonor were saying, this emergency demands special measures, autocrats are taking these special measures in their favor to grab more power, to not be subject to the rule of law. I like to put it this way. Epidemics need special measures, but special measures also need epidemics. And this is where we have to be very careful.
Thank you, Carlos. Let me just follow up with you on that point, because we've received a couple of questions online suggesting that we haven't given enough time or credit to the effectiveness of the measures adopted in El Salvador to combat the spread of the virus. I think you actually spoke to this very well at the beginning of your presentation, but maybe you could just revisit this and just kind of talk us through once more the distinction you're drawing between the early and aggressive measures taken to respond to the virus and the subsequent overreach and risks to rule of law that have emerged in the weeks since.
I'm sorry, Michael, I'm not sure I understand the question.
The question is essentially that that President Bukele has been effective in responding to COVID-19 as a public health matter, and that we're not sufficiently acknowledging that.
No, I don't think so, no. The health workers are complaining because they don't have enough equipment. Bukele decided in his grandeur style to build a hospital from scratch, while in front of the building site that is only in like 15% accomplished, in front of it we have the Feria Internacional, which is a huge complex of empty buildings. because it's for international fairs. But he refused to use it because he wanted to put his own seal in this crisis, which is this grandiose hospital that is never going to be completed before we need it. Meanwhile, what's happening in the hospitals of the public system is that the hospitals themselves have become contagion centers. The people in mandatory quarantine was 30 days for some reason that has not been explained scientifically by anyone. And I am not saying this is not the way it should be. I'm just saying that we have no information, right? Well, there's people with 40 days there, because what happened is that while they were on quarantine, new people came by. So this contact basically starts a quarantine from zero, right? You're talking about thousands of people in this situation, not 2 or 3. And right now, quarantine is not a health measure. It's not a sanitary measure. Quarantine is, I'm sorry, my English is getting, so how do you say castigo?
A punishment.
Quarantine has become a punishment for disobeying the rule of Bukele. So if a soldier sees you on the street and you can't justify why you're there, or just because he wants to, and we've seen the cases, a lot of cases of military and policemen just grabbing anyone they just happen to have in front and take him to a quarantine center. And they were going to the pharmacy to buy medicines for their mother, or they were going to buy some food for their families. But the Minister of Defense was asked, how do you know if someone is really out because they need to get some food? And the answer of the Minister of Defense was like, you can see it in their eyes. That's how fragile you are in front of these authorities. This is, again, a healthy crisis that is being ruled by weapons on the streets. Over the weekend in La Libertad, we saw tanks on the entrance of the city. Can you imagine, Michael, or anyone who is listening to us, a single scenario in this crisis that a tank would be useful? One single scenario. Why would you need a tank? There's no scenario possible that demands you to use a tank. But that's where we are now. So no, I never said he imposed successful healthy measures. I said he took the right decisions, but that he didn't implement them in the properly order, which makes me conclude, because I have no other conclusion, because things have not changed, that his aim was not a healthy aim. It was control. That's my fear.
Thank you, Carlos. Very clear. Leonor, we're pretty much out of time, but I want to come to you for a final word. We received a question for you about civil society in El Salvador, and I think you and the other speakers have spoken eloquently to the role that civil society is playing in challenging some of these measures and standing up for rule of law in El Salvador. And the question is specifically about the civil society organizations in the country that are playing this role. If you could kind of mention a few of who they are and the work that they're doing for folks who are interested.
I think that we should be really proud of what civil society groups in El Salvador are doing right now. Different groups that in the past didn't really work together now are coming, like to joint efforts, and there's basically a consensus among so many different civil society groups on the concerns and on what this government is doing. So just small civil society groups, groups outside capital, big groups in El Salvador, they're all throwing out statements, using the judicial system, alerting international actors, and they all need support for these efforts to sustain. So, and also Bukele is trying to say that civil society groups in general are not valid actors. And I think this is a very dangerous message, because in a democracy, civil society groups are definitely a very important part of any democratic play, right? So, and I just want to end saying that everything that we're talking about, what happened in February when Bukele tried to force the Legislative Assembly to approve a loan, and what we're seeing now with this pandemic, it's basically a test from Bukele, right? He's trying to see how far he can go, and he's basically preparing on what he wants to do with the upcoming election of next year, when he basically wants to take control of the executive and the legislature, and he also might even try to change the constitution. So this is pretty alarming, and I think we all should keep posted on the developments, and to raise our voice, and not to let that Bukele's messages just silence everybody.
Absolutely. We will continue to follow it from the dialogue, and I'm sure you all will as well. So hopefully this is a conversation we can continue to have. I want to thank our three terrific speakers, Carlos Dada, Leonor Arteaga, Jose Miguel Vivanco. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for sharing your perspectives and your expertise. Keep up the good work, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you, everyone who's able to join us for this conversation. I want to thank my colleague, Catherine Christie, for her help pulling this together. And we will see you again soon for another of these series of events on COVID-19 and the impact in the Americas. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.